the shootout scenario is the one scenario where I can see fading CMC, but otherwise it's hard to figure out how he fails. He's been the most consistent player in the NFL.
1 week season.
Hey, welcome in OWS Fam. Glad you are with us. We are back in the lab here and DFS Lab Showdown Edition here at 1 week season. Tonight it's the Jets at the 49ers. It is Monday, September 9th. We are up early grinding for you on this one. Remember, the purpose of this show is to build a DraftKings lineup and really use that as a vehicle to talk through strategy. In this case, tonight, I'm your host, Cheeseman. I'll be with you here on the DFS Lab 4 days a week with this Monday show always being showdown focused. And make sure if you find value in this channel, give us a like and subscribe to the channel. We'd really appreciate it. And with that, he is Xandamere, and he joins me now here on Showdown. Xandamere, you are a busy man. I'm not sure if people realize how many things you do at 1 week season. You are obviously the showdown expert, writing all of the write-ups for the site for these island games, but you also head up the props package at OWS, which consistently crushes it. You're a huge player, of course, in the main slate, and you and Hilo combine to bring OWS subscribers the Slate podcast every week, which is an exclusive show for OWS Inner Circle that airs every Saturday morning, breaking down the main slate. And that show is pretty much a must listen for me every week. I certainly listened to it this past week. So how you doing? How you feeling after week one, and how you feeling about tonight's game?
I also do our ownership projections.
That's right.
I am busy. I am feeling great. You know, week one is in the books, or almost in the books. It was a good start to the season for OWS. We had some showdown wins on the first night of the season on Thursday. We had some nice wins through our community yesterday. I think that I'm biased, but I think our content was pretty on point in how we talked through games, how we talked through strategy. You know, OWS is not a player pick site. We're not going to be, you play this guy and this guy, this guy, don't play that guy. Like, the game of DFS is deeper than that. And so we're talking more about strategy and how to think through slates and how to position yourself against a lot of other players. And I think we were good in that, because it takes a lot of time sometimes to wind up, you know, like sometimes it takes a while to reach mid-season form. You hear them talk about athletes with that, right? It's the same for people talking about athletes, you know, coming off of not talking about football for months. It can be a bit of a ramp up period, I think. So I'm really happy with how week one went for us as a site. I'm happy with how it went for our users. I'm excited to dig in here, finish out the week strong, and then get to week two.
Absolutely. I mean, when you talk about week one and how OWS subscribers did do well, let's start it off by looking at a showdown lineup that an OWS member had from Thursday night. As you can see, a first place finish, almost 100K. Very exciting. But let's look at the lineup and just kind of use that to transition into this show. What worked about this lineup? Obviously, you can see the bill. I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah. So the first thing to notice, I think, about this lineup is the construction. So I always think, like when I break down showdown lineups, I look at the construction of how many players in which team, right? And so there's 2 Ravens and 4 Chiefs. The Chiefs won the game. And so when as you'd expect, when the Chiefs win the game, it's more likely that there are more Chiefs on the winning lineup. But you have a Ravens captain. So it's a 2-4 construction is how I think about it. If it had been a Chiefs captain, it would have been a 4-2 construction, right? 4 players on the side that won the game. A 2-4 construction is not the most common construction to win in Showdown, but the reason it worked here is in a 2-4 construction, what you're looking for is a disproportionate amount of one team's scoring to take place in in one player. And that player ends up being the captain, right? Like when you have a high volume of a high percentage of a team's fantasy production coming from one player, then that player's score skyrockets, and that player can be the optimal captain, where they get that captain point multiplier, right? So Isaiah Likely had a huge game. He wasn't the highest scoring player of the game, right? Lamar Jackson was, but because of the salary multiplier in the DraftKings format, it was not possible for Lamar to be the optimal captain because he was so expensive. And so we had a cheap player, Isaiah Likely, who was low salary, who had a huge game, and thus ended up being the optimal captain. Because if you look at the rest of the Ravens and you go look at the rest of the Ravens fantasy production, it was quite low, right? I think in DraftKings scoring, I want to say Justice Hill made it to 10 fantasy points. Did Zay Flowers? I'm not sure.
I think he might have made it to 11, but not a high-scoring game for him.
Yeah, pretty low. So, Isaiah Likely and Lamar Jackson are the only Ravens to make it to 15 fantasy points. Whereas, as you can see in this roster, there were 4 Chiefs that made it 15 fantasy points. So, really a disproportionate chunk of fantasy production for the Baltimore Ravens came through this one guy. Second is the pricing allocation. So, Isaiah Likely was a cheap player on this slate. He was one of our favorite cheap plays in the slate. He was written about, I think I wrote like an entire paragraph about him in the article. He'd been getting great reviews coming out of camp. We knew the Ravens, the Ravens basically had Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews in the receiving core, and then some people that just didn't inspire a tremendous amount of confidence, Rashad Bateman, Nelson Aguilar. And so it seemed likely, that we might see Isaiah Likely on the field a little bit more this season. And we'd always seen him perform when given the opportunity when Mark Andrews missed time. And so we knew he was super, super talented. And so he was one of our favorite cheap plays on the slate. And where this lineup kind of took it a step further is instead of using him in flex, normally you'd say a cheap player, you put him in your flex spot. So you could afford an expensive captain. So there were a lot of lineups out there that had Isaiah Likely in the flex, and they had like Rashee Rice or Zay Flowers or Mark Andrews or Travis Kelce or Isaiah Pacheco or Lamar Jackson in the captain spot. And you use the punt player so you can afford the expensive captain. This guy was really sharp by taking it a step further and saying, well, what if Likely has a really big game? Like, what if Likely is actually the optimal captain? And one of the interesting things about the DraftKings format is the optimal captain doesn't have to be the highest scoring player because of the 1.5 scoring multiplier, but also the 1.5 salary multiplier. So, like, again, Lamar Jackson was the highest scoring player, but he wasn't the optimal captain because you couldn't fit him in. You couldn't fit the rest of the players in, rather, around him if you made him the captain. And really, Likely was close, right? Like, I think Lamar, he scored 27-something, 26-something fantasy points without the captain multiplier. So he was right behind Lamar. And that made him the optimal captain, even though he wasn't the highest scoring player in the game. And you also see this lineup is not a highly contrarian lineup, except that one decision. And so we talk a lot about Showdown when there's only one game and 2 teams. You need to think about differentiation quite a bit in Showdown to avoid duplication. It's very rare in Showdown for an unduplicated lineup to get a solo win in a big tournament.
Yeah.
But in this case, and this wasn't a solo win. You can tell by the salary or the winnings, right? With 93 cents at the end. But it was not a win that had a ton of ties at the top. I've seen big Showdown tournaments won by huge trains of lineups where they make $3,000 or $4,000, which is nice if you only entered one lineup, I suppose, but not this kind of life-changing money. And so you have to think about differentiation quite a lot. And this guy had 5 players who were all almost 40% owned or higher. I mean, Worthy slightly under 40%, and then Likely, who was 14%, which is lower, but in the world that's not nothing, right? And so if you look at the lineups where Likely was in the flex spot, they would be a lot more duplicated than this one. Because Likely was a fairly popular punt play, fairly popular flex play to fit in a stud captain. But if you're betting that Likely could actually just have a really big game and not have like a game of 10 points that makes him a good flex play, he was under 1% owned at captain because people didn't see the ceiling for him.
Wow.
The captain spot ceiling. And so just the one decision of putting Likely at captain allowed him to build a roster of chalk. And build a roster of just the best plays, right? Of just really strong plays, top to bottom, and take down a tournament with very little duplication for a really huge win, and just shy of a 6-figure win. And the point here is that you don't have to do 17 different things to make your lineup unique. You only have to do one. Like this one choice of running Likely at captain meant he could essentially do whatever he wanted with the rest of his lineup, and he would be very, very, what's the term for close to unique? Not quite unique, but he's close to unique, right? Very, very little duplication of this roster just based on that one simple thing. And so I think people get hung up sometimes in like, I have to do this and this and this and this to be not duplicated. No, you don't. You really only have to do the one thing, right? Just the one thing is enough. So it's a super sharp lineup, and he also kind of only need to get that one thing right. Like we want to build lineups that don't need a million things to go in our favor. Like he had Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, the 2 highest projected plays in the slate. He had Rashee Rice, who we talked about in the article as being the single best pass catcher play on the slate. He had Isaiah Pacheco, the Chiefs were RB1, and on a team that won the game, right? Like RB1 production correlates well with winning games. He had Worthy, who was a rookie, but a talented rookie who was likely to have a solid role in the offense, especially given that we knew the Chiefs have been talking about kind of scaling back Travis Kelce's role a little bit in the regular season as he's getting older to preserve him for the playoffs. So all those plays made total sense. None of them were super contrarian plays. They were all just really strong top to bottom plays, which is also why they were owned. And by doing that one thing with Likely, he could just essentially not worry about, about anything regarding uniqueness or ownership on the rest of his lineup and just kind of play the good plays. And so really sharp lineup. Congratulations to him. We had another winner who had the same lineup in a smaller contest and took down 14K. Congratulations to those guys. Really, really sharp lineup construction. Love to see the big wins early in the season and then start the season off with a bang. Well deserved to you guys.
Yeah, and great analysis, Xandamere. That's I'm excited to be doing the show with you. I feel like I'm going to learn a lot just about Showdown. And it just, it's Showdown is high volatility, but I love how that point that you made is that Likely was a popular flex play and people really liked him, but they weren't going that extra step to make him the captain. And so that a lot of times you can see that as an opportunity, like, because a lot of times people are going to say, I want Lamar, I want, or in the case of tonight, I want CMC as captain, I want Breece Hall as captain. They want to play the super stud as captain, but being able to kind of look a little off the board. Is there a popular flex that just is his ownership in the flex is not correlating to his captain ownership? And maybe we won't have that situation exactly tonight because it drops off a little bit pretty steeply after your studs in this game. But I love just kind of seeing that flex opportunity and taking it to captain to nail it. But let's look at tonight's game. Let's get started on this. First of all, I just wanted to get your overall thoughts on kind of the just kind of how this game may go and kind of looking at this. I believe that the 49ers are 3.5-point favorites. They're at home. We have a ton of studs in this game. So a lot of times you might think instant offense and think, how many touchdowns will CMC score? But you also have two very good defenses, two defenses that were ranked in the top 5 overall in Pro Football Focus from last season. And so what are your initial kind of thoughts in terms of what Vegas is telling us, and then also some outlier outcomes for how this game could potentially go?
Yeah, so last year, the 49ers allowed 18.8 points per game, offensive points per game, and the Jets allowed 20.9. Those are both low numbers, right? You kind of have to throw out the Jets' points scored per game because Aaron Rodgers didn't even make it through, a quarter. So you kind of have to throw that out, right? But the 49ers managed to score, the 49ers offense is an engine. I mean, they scored 28.6 points a game last year, which was second behind the Dallas Cowboys. The consistency of the 49ers is amazing. The 49ers did not score fewer than 17 points in a game the entire season, which is like stunning. Usually every offense flubs at some point, right? So really just an amazing bit of consistency from the 49ers. And those were all offensive points. Like they didn't score fewer than 17 offensive points the entire season. So the Jets are a great defense. But I expect the 49ers to score. I think it's, they might not score 4 touchdowns, but I think it's the odds of them getting really shut down are very unlikely just based on what we've seen from this offense. They're, I'll say, mostly fully healthy with one caveat that we'll get to in just a little bit. But they're all the remaining guys are active, right? Like all the remaining pass catchers, CMC, Brock Purdy, they're all active for the game. So it's hard for me to see the Jets stopping the 49ers. Does that mean the 49ers are guaranteed to beat their team total or the game is a guarantee to go over? No, right? They could score 2 touchdowns or 3 touchdowns and not 4 or 5. But I think it's unlikely the 49ers score 0 or 1 touchdown, right? Like that's just a very hard outcome to see. It's it's a hard outcome to see for most good offenses, but most good offenses still fail somewhere during the season, right? The 49ers they're so creative. They have so many different weapons. It's so hard to game plan for them. And so I'm confident they're going to score. The wild card are the Jets because there was so much excitement over the Jets when they signed Aaron Rodgers last year. And they had some weapons. They had Garrett Wilson. They had Breece Hall coming back from an injury. They had some really talented really talented skill position players. But the reality is we haven't seen it from the Jets. Aaron Rodgers now missed an entire year. And so, coming back from major injury, we don't know how he's going to return. If you look at, say, Kirk Cousins, just yesterday, I saw this on Twitter, Kirk Cousins was moving like a dad who was trying not to hurt himself in a game of pickup basketball, right? Like, because his first game back. Is Aaron Rodgers going to be fully mobile? And, is he going to be the same Aaron Rodgers that we're used to seeing? Or is he going to, is he going to take some time to ramp up? He's not a young guy, right? This is a major injury he suffered. Is he going to be the same guy ever? I hope so. Is he going to be the same guy in game one? I don't know. And we haven't seen the offense click with him because we haven't seen the offense with him. We know that Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson are really good players, but sometimes it takes the offense time to develop a rapport and work together. All the reports out of camp are that Aaron Rodgers and Garrett Wilson had a really strong connection, and we know that Rodgers is the kind of guy who historically has kind of latched on to one primary receiver and elevated that guy. I mean, we saw it with Jordy Nelson. We saw it with Devontae Adams. So, I think there's upside there, but I think we haven't seen it. And until we've seen it, it's hard to say it's going to happen. I think that's the bull case. The bull case for the Jets is Aaron Rodgers is really good. Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson are really good. Rodgers has historically delivered strong offensive performances, in many cases without a huge bevy of offensive skill position player talent. Like Green Bay the last few years was like Devontae Adams and then whoever else at wide receiver and tight end, right? And so
yeah, exactly.
So I think there's upside for the Jets, but I think that the Jets are the riskier offensive team to me. I think there is more risk if the Jets fail to score offensively than there is the 49ers fail to score offensively. And then if you go into the salaries, one of the interesting dynamics here is that all the value really is on the Jets side, which is both interesting and terrifying. If you look below, and when I say value plays in Showdown, I think kickers and below. And so if you go look down, the value
I'm gonna just jump into a contest here. We had talked about a little bit about like the 10K huddle, just looking at kind of a single entry contest in this case. So I'm just gonna jump in here. This contest is 2,400 entries, and just to look at the payout structure real fast, 1K to the top, and my little widget isn't pulling up here. Normally it comes up with a percentage, like what percentage goes to first, what percentage is in the top 10. But this looks like a pretty flat, for the most part, payout. So anyway, you were talking about salaries, so go ahead.
Yeah, so you mentioned that there's all these studs on the slate. In order to fit studs, you need value, right?
Right, yes.
If you scroll down, I say value, I think of as kickers and below. And so you see all those, just look at the columns, like scroll down to the kickers being at the top of your screen there. And then look at the columns. The bold column is the column the team the player's on. Look at the SFs. We see Moody, we see Jennings, we see Mason. And look at the NYJs. There's just a lot more Jets down in that price range. And there's 4 49ers if you scroll farther down. But there's only 2 49ers that we have a strong expectation of seeing meaningful snaps this game. And that is Kyle Juszczyk, who is, of course, a fullback, who is not a primary offensive weapon. He's a blocker, although
he's down there at 600.
Yeah, although Use will occasionally get 3-4 targets if he gets a touchdown. He scored, I want to say he scored 2 touchdowns last year, I believe. He had 2 games of 10+ fantasy points, which at 600 probably puts him in the optimal lineup. So he's not nothing, but he's not exactly a consistent offensive contributor. And then you've got Juwan Jennings, who's priced like a kicker, who also has very sporadic games of consistent offensive production. Generally, especially, it's rare for the 49ers wide receivers 3 spot to result in fantasy production when the other guys are healthy. Right?
Yeah, coin flip basically, or just, not a high percentage bet.
Yeah, so that's all you got, the 49ers. Whereas the Jets, you've got Jordan Mason, who's, we talk about a lot in the article about how to think about and how to play Jordan Mason as the backup running back to Christian McCaffrey. And then you've got, for the Jets, though, you've got, you've got Alan Lazard and Tyler Conklin, who are both full-time players. And, Lazard is, 2K, I think, and Conklin is 3,600. Those are both full-time players who are going to be on the field almost the entire game, or such is the expectation. And then you have some more rotational wide receiver types like Xavier Gibson. You've got rookie Conley, who may or may not see the field. Corley, Malachi Corley. The reports out of camp were basically like talented, but incredibly inconsistent, raw. So he may or may not see the field. Aaron Rodgers does not have a great history of having a lot of patience with developing rookie receivers.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. He likes to lock on to someone, and you know what? And I know you talked in your article about Garrett Wilson. So, real quick though, let's take a look at kind of. I know you wanted to just touch on just contest size differentiation, because obviously, you know, how are you going to attack tonight's slate? Are you going to be putting in multiple lineups, more of a multi-entry, 3-entry max? In this case, we're looking at a single entry. So what are kind of the big take-home points for things to think about, like building for the contest that you're playing?
Yeah, so this is a really common topic, like in our Discord. People talk about this a lot. I get asked questions about it a lot, is how do you think about how much differentiation, how do you think about ownership when building for a 500-person contest or 1,000-person contest versus building for a 100,000-person contest? And there's no easy answer to this question. There's no way I can say, oh, well, if under 873 entries, the math says, that's feel, it's art, not science. But one thing you'll commonly hear is that in smaller contests, you don't need to be as different because you often don't need as high of a score to win them, because people aren't, if a guy's 1% owned and has a big game, and if in a 100,000 entry giant tournament, that's 1,000 lineups have that player, right? Versus say 10 lineups have that player in a 1,000-person contest. So it's less likely that someone has the right players around that player, that low-owned guy who has a big game. Like you say, Alec Pierce yesterday, right? Like, fewer people are going to have the right players around Mr. Pierce in a 1,000-person contest, because there just aren't as many people with him.
Point, yeah.
But the other thing, there's a flip side to that coin, which is that because in smaller contests the chalk gets chalkier, you get paid off more for being right when you make contrarian plays. So a player that's, in Showdown, say, in Showdown, it's pretty rare to see a player go over 50, maybe 60% ownership in a big tournament, especially a skill position player. But in small tournaments, you might see a player like Christian McCaffrey, say a skill position player, you might see them get up to 70, 80% ownership. And so if you decide to fade Christian McCaffrey and you're right, you get paid off a lot more in a small contest than a big contest, right? In a big contest, you might still be competing with half the entries in the field. In a small contest, you might only be competing against a third of the entries in the field, right? The 2/3 got knocked out if Christian McCaffrey at high ownership fails. And I'm not saying fake Christian McCaffrey, right? That's how to think about ownership. So it's riskier, but you get paid off more. You don't necessarily need to do it, but if you're willing to do it, you get paid off more. But in smaller contests, and this is more broad than just Showdown, in smaller contests, you generally don't need, you don't need perfection. What you generally need to do to have a high finish or win is avoid landmines, right? You're not looking to have every spot perfect necessarily. In Showdown, of course, it's, even in Showdown, like the optimal lineup wins at a high rate, but the smaller the contest, the less likely the optimal lineup is found. What you're looking to do is just not have mistakes, right? And so I think that being contrarian in small field play is less about finding the 1% play that hits and more about finding the 50% of play that misses. That's more important, right?
I like that.
So, again, we'll use yesterday's slate as an example. In small field play, I was less about trying to find the Alec Pierce, and Alec Pierce is not the kind of player who fits my player profile that I'm going to find. But that's not the important thing in small. And you can see that if you look at small field contests, most of them were won without Alec Pierce in the lineup. But the large field contests had him. I was more about thinking, it's like the big thing for me was I didn't play any of Andrei Yoshivas, who was a super popular punt play because he was so cheap. He's going to have he's going to be on the field a ton for the Bengals with T. Higgins out, Jamar Chase limited. And so I thought it was a terrible game environment, super low scoring game against a really good defense. So anyway, I didn't play Andrei Yoshivas in small field play. And so for me, that was my stand. I wasn't trying to find the 1% dude who's going to have a big game. I was saying, who of these really chalky players, who's the player I'm the least confident in? And so you can take the same approach Showdown. And so we don't have our ownership up, but we will in a few hours. And you can look at some of the really highly owned plays and say, who's the player here that I am the least confident, or the 2 or 3 players I'm the least confident And so in small field play, that's how I'd think about differentiation and ownership, is not so much like, let me find the guy, let me scroll down to the very bottom and find the guy who, is on the field for 4 snaps, but maybe gets a touchdown. Like, that's not what I'm looking for in small field play for differentiation. That's what I look for in large field play.
Yeah.
And small field play, I'm more looking for, like, who's the guy who projects for 50% ownership or 40% ownership, or who are a few of those guys who I can avoid. And if they fail, then I'm in a really good position.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. I feel like I'm picking up stuff in real time. Just that is a huge shift in perspective. Large field, trying to find the Alec Pierce versus small field, just trying not to hit the landmine. And I just, a quick plug for 1 week season, you and Hilo, I also completely faded Yosevach. I don't know if I said that right yesterday in my lineups. And it was mainly based off of listening to you and Hilo on the Slate podcast on Saturday, breaking down that game and saying, how are the Bengals going to go about things now that their big studs are out? How is this game going to go? And is Yosevach really the answer? So just a plug. You guys had great analysis of that in the Slate. So, okay, so let's jump over to DraftKings here, and let's start looking at building this lineup. And it really starts, obviously we start at the captain position, and a big decision point on this slate is Christian McCaffrey. We're building here again for single entry, but with CMC, he's so consistent. I was looking at some numbers last season. There were 6 times where he had 28 plus DraftKings points, and for the most part, I would say a dud. His worst game, I think, was 13 or 14 fantasy points, but for the most part, he's pretty bankable for at least 20, at least based off of last season. And so what would even be a game where, I don't think you can say I'm going to fade CMC and hope that he gets 5 fantasy points like that. That's very unlikely unless he gets hurt. And of course we don't hope for that. But if you're fading CMC or making the decision to play him, what are you kind of looking at his range of outcomes? Let's say if you do decide to fade him and say he gets, 19 fantasy points and what that means. Hopefully that kind of makes sense and you can run with that.
Yeah, what you're looking for if you fade CMC is not so much, it's not just about him, right? Because Showdown especially is this like interlinked web of players within a salary constraint. Because it's not just about what CMC does, it's about what other players do. And so, like, for example, it's really challenging to fit CMC, especially at captain, with 3 other studs, like, say, and the pricing is loose early on, right? But it's hard to fit something like CMC along with Brock Purdy and Deebo Samuel and Garrett Wilson. Like, it's hard to fit those 4 guys. And so you're less looking for, does CMC flop and only score 10 points or 12 points? You're more looking for, do other guys just have big games around him? And so that, even he can get 17, 18, 19 points and possibly still not be in the optimal, because if, say, Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel also get 17, 18, 19 points, and Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson get 17, 18, 19 points, but they're all cheaper than CMC, right? The problem is, it's tough to see. Like, this is a relatively low projected game for Vegas, right? And so how do you see a scenario playing out where all, like, Deebo and Ayuk and Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, or you can replace like Aaron Rodgers or Brock Purdy for a couple of those guys, right? Like, it's, how do you see 4 other players getting to like that 20 point-ish threshold, and CMC does, which is pretty likely? Like, it's difficult to see how that plays out in a game. And the one way is that this game devolves into a shootout, right? Like, so if this game is a shootout and there's like, and it ends up being a 50-55 total game and the touchdowns just don't happen to flow CMC's way, that's the most likely way that CMC doesn't end up in the optimal lineup. Is because there needs to be enough fantasy scoring going around that enough other guys put up scores that are competitive with CMC's. And it's your point, right? Like, anything's possible in football. CMC could get hurt on the first play. We hope not, but we can't build around that. We can't build around that hypothesis, right? But outside of that, if CMC plays a full game, he's a near lock for at least 15 points. And so the way that doesn't end up in the optimal lineup is that there's enough fantasy production going around that enough other guys get to that similar or higher point threshold that CMC, despite putting up a fair number of points because of his high salary, just doesn't end up in the optimal lineup. So for me, the best game scripts in order to that do not have CMC in them are the ones that predicate this game being a much higher scoring game than expected, a shootout. And so in those games, if it's not CMC doing the scoring, I feel like I definitely want Brock Purdy, right? Because if it's not CMC doing the scoring, then where's the scoring coming from? And we know we need a lot of scoring, and we know it's not coming through CMC, which means it's coming through the air. Or it's Jordan Mason vulturing, I suppose, but we haven't seen the 49ers deploy like vulture running backs at the goal line. Like they're happy to use CMC at the goal line. So it's most likely going to be like, I want Brock Purdy in that lineup, and I want at least 2 of his pass catchers. And then I want, I want probably at least one of Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson, because I'm saying this is a shootout, right? So I want the main 49ers pass catchers. I want one of the Jets' 2 main offensive weapons. And I don't want the defenses in this lineup, because I'm saying this game is a high scoring shootout, and that's how CMC doesn't end up in the optimal. Nothing's for sure in football, of course, but I think that outside of that shootout scenario, it's really hard to see how CMC doesn't end up in the optimal lineup. The only other scenario we could talk through, you'll know that CMC has that questionable tag next to him. He's playing through a calf injury. He has said he is fine and will be playing. The 49ers, there's no expectation he misses the game. But it's possible that it's a bit of a nagging injury. It's possible the 49ers say, hey, we're going to try to not give you a monster workload in week 1, right? Like, we know we're going to the playoffs. We know that's what we're playing for. So a big priority is keeping the guys healthy throughout the year. They didn't baby CMC last year. They gave him significant workloads, lots of games of well over 20 running back opportunities. But with that questionable tag, it's at least a possibility. They decide, hey, game 1, especially if we don't need you, we're going to scale the workload back a little bit. And so what does that look like? That looks like, a 49ers romp where the Jets are just not competitive. The Jets offense flubs, and the 49ers win the game easily. And they say, hey, we're up by 2 touchdowns at halftime. The Jets, it's up 17-3. The Jets offense has looked absolutely terrible. We feel we're going to scale you back in the second half. And that would mean more Jordan Mason. The problem in that scenario is that CMC can easily still end up in the optimal lineup, because in that scenario, the Jets aren't doing very much, and so you're probably looking to 5-1 San Francisco construction, and so you can't count on but multiple Jets coming back the other way to occupy some of those lineup spots and to outscore CMC. And the other thing is that CMC can easily get his on the way up, right? Like CMC can score 2 touchdowns and then be like, okay, I'm done, but still have 24 fantasy points. So I think that there's that the shootout scenario is the one scenario where I could see fading CMC, but otherwise, like if you look at game scenarios where CMC is more or less likely to put up a fantasy score that lands him in the optimal lineup, like it's hard to figure out where it doesn't come from. It's hard to figure out how he fails. He's been the most consistent player in the NFL. I mean, if you go look at his fantasy production last year, he had 3 games under 19 fantasy points. Every other game, 19 or more fantasy points, which is just absolutely insane, right?
Exactly. Yeah, looking at it here. Yeah.
And one of those was a 42-10 drubbing of the Dallas Cowboys, right? And I don't know that I don't have the showdown, the showdown slate for that. He got 14.8 fantasy points. I couldn't tell you if he's in the optimal lineup of that one. I guess there's a good chance he still was, but I don't know for sure.
Right, because of the onslaught build. So, okay, so in this lineup, who do you want to go with at captain? What direction do you want to go?
Let's actually start with CMC. And I know that's like the super chalky play, but I think that a lot of people are going to be trying to figure out, how do I build the CMC captain lineup in a way that is smart and somewhat differentiated?
Yeah, so let's look at that. So CMC is captain. So, where do you go next year? Obviously, you got these studs at the top. Breece, Garrett Wilson, Debo, Ayuk a little bit down here. The quarterbacks are tough in this matchup, but if you have CMC as captain, are you pretty much saying you probably don't play Purdy here, or what do you think?
So this is where our showtime gets tricky, because there's a lot of ways we could go here, and we could go down multiple forks in this path. You could absolutely play Purdy with CMC, right? Because one, we could see does the 49ers romp. CMC also had 8 receiving touchdowns last year. So, I think you can absolutely play Purdy with Christian McCaffrey. In this lineup, I'm going to say let's build around it being a competitive game because it's easier to build 5-1 onslaught lineups, right? You just pick 5 49ers, pick 1 Jet, call it a day. It's easier to build those sort of lineups. So like let's build around a competitive game.
Okay.
And so the next pick is the most likely piece to make this a competitive game with CMC at captain would be Garrett Wilson. Breece Hall is viable, but we know that opposing running backs have at least a modest negative correlation to each other because running backs rely on a lot of volume, and volume relies on controlling time of possession because it relies on running a lot of plays. And running backs, run plays take more time off the clock than pass plays. So running backs have a slight negative correlation. It's not that you can't play CMC and Hall together. Especially in the single game format, you absolutely can. But between the two of them, I'm going to lean slightly to Garrett Wilson in my CMC captain lineup because of the correlation and because of I'm going to trust not just camp reports. I mean, preseason reports only have so much weight about like the connection between Rodgers and Wilson. Preseason reports only have so much weight that I can attribute to them. But because they match what we've seen from Aaron Rodgers so often in his career, I feel like I can put some trust in that and saying, okay, yeah, I think it's likely that he has developed that connection. And he's going to stick with that connection to Garrett Wilson. So let's go Garrett Wilson as our next piece.
Okay, so we got Christian McCaffrey, Garrett Wilson, average 5,700 remaining. Do you want to look at another stud, or do you want to kind of look at some salary saving options to try and give flexibility here next?
Let's look for salary because, and this is usually when I'm building by hand, this is how I go because I want to find the value play because that kind of unlocks things and lets me know what I can do with the rest of my lineup. I will also note in this particular slate, the mid-range is pretty barren. You've got like the kickers and the DSTs, but then like from skill position plays, you got Mike Williams coming back off an ACL injury. Reports that he's healthy, but also that he's probably not going to have a full-time role. He's going to have some kind of pitch count. You've got George Kittle, and then you get up to Brandon Ayuk, who's 8,400. It's like really that sort of 5, 6, 7K mid-range is pretty barren. So it's kind of forcing us to do a stars and scrubs construction. And that's okay, but it's important to note that that's the layout of this particular showdown.
Yeah, so I noticed that. Yeah, noticed that when I was trying to build last night. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so let's really quick look at value plays. So you've got Jordan Mason as value play, but I don't want to play the RB2 when I have the RB1 at captain. I'd consider that maybe in a 5-1 onslaught, but we know we're not building a 5-1 onslaught. We've got Kyle Juszczyk. Kyle Juszczyk is a blocker who most likely, he might get a touchdown pass or two, but here's the thing. The most likely guy he's taking that touchdown pass from is CMC because he's running out of the backfield as a blocker. He's kind of running along where the running back usually runs. And so it's like if Kyle Juszczyk gets a touchdown, it's most likely that if that play hadn't been Juszczyk, it probably would have been CMC instead. And I want that to go to CMC in this lineup since I have CMC at captain. So I don't think that Juszczyk makes the best pairing in a CMC captain lineup. Juwan Jennings is a player I just very rarely play when all the 49ers are healthy. So those are the 49ers main value plays. I'm not going to get into all the various like rotational guys who play 6 snaps. I mean, you can take shots on them in MME play, but like we're building for single entry. So that leaves the Jets. And there's 2 options there really, which is Allen Lazard, who's, one of Aaron Rodgers' old buddies from Green Bay. And who he brought him and Cobb, and I don't even know how many other, he's like bring the whole team over. And then we've got Tyler Conklin. And so because both of those are viable value plays and they're going to be popular, but Allen Lazard, I think, is the weaker of the 2 because, one, he's a wide receiver. And I think that I've got, if you think about where the ball is going and where the production is going, like I've got Garrett Wilson as my core jet. And so it's not to say that 2 wide receivers in the same team can't succeed. Of course they can. But I'm looking for those kind of more downfield targets. I'm looking for Aaron Rodgers to lock on to Garrett Wilson. And kind of like hit him over and over with those more downfield routes. And so I'm going to go Tyler Conklin. And Aaron Rodgers loves using his tight ends in the red zone. And so sort of my hope here is the way this plays out is that Garrett Wilson gets tons of targets and is the key guy in moving the ball down the field. And then Tyler Conklin delivers the touchdown in the end zone.
So now we have 6,400 left remaining per player. So what direction do you want to go now?
So I will say this is where it gets tricky in this particular build, because with CMC, and this is why CMC captain builds are tough. If you just look at 6,400 left and you look at like what's available, there's not much in that mid range. If we want to get one more stud, like even say if we want to get Aaron Rodgers to pair with his 2 pass catchers, like if you click Aaron Rodgers real quick, just to put him in there and see, we have two Jets pass catchers. Aaron Rodgers clearly a very viable play in that build. 5,100 leaves us at a really ugly spot. You know, even if you put in like you're basically at that point forced to either play like double kicker, which is okay. And especially in a small field format, kickers are sort of high floor plays. Double kicker is a play that we generally try to avoid in large field tournaments because it generally doesn't get you sort of the absolute ceiling. But it's good. It's fine in small field. But also that leaves us with 4 Jets, which is, you know, okay. Again, you're expecting, if you're building around that scenario, you're expecting like the vast majority of the 49ers production to come through Christian McCaffrey in the captain spot, which is okay. But like it feels like if you do that, you're almost forced into playing another value play. And I don't know that I want, you know, to do that. But I think I'm going to have to, because like let's take Aaron Rodgers out, and this is kind of a construction I've been fiddling around with. Let's put Allen Lazard in, and I know I mentioned why I chose Conklin over Lazard, but let's put Lazard in. Let's just see what we can do with it.
Yeah.
Now we have 8,600, right? And so now we can choose one more stud or one more. Well, if you call George Kittle a stud, I suppose. And so you have 8,600. So you could do Ayuk and Kittle. That'd be a weird build, right? Not awful, but like it'd be weird to see Ayuk and Kittle both hit and Christian McCaffrey hit without Brock Purdy also hitting, right? You could do, like, if you put Kittle in, you could do one more stud. You could do Purdy,
right? And I'll just say it's the reality that we face with the 49ers, because yeah, it's a lot of times I was facing the same thing when I was trying to build last night. It's just, well, if I put in a pass catch, do I need to put Purdy in? But yeah, so like you said, you could put Purdy. If you put Purdy in right now, you could put Kittle, but you couldn't put Ayuk.
Correct. So the way I'm going to go here, like I think really you have a couple of directions to go at this point. I think you put in Lazard. And again, it's like what you're hoping for here is he's a guy who's on the field a lot, right? Like, and you're just saying like, I have these are the 3 Jets pass catchers who are going to run the most routes. And you're just saying like, even if they don't score, especially like Conklin and Lazard, they don't have to score to put up viable fantasy scores, right?
Exactly.
So let's put in Lazard. That gets us enough salary. And you're also saying, I hope this game doesn't kick a bunch of field goals, right? Like, because you're avoiding the kicker. Another viable path here would be to use one or both kickers and then one more stud like an Aaron Rodgers or Brock Purdy. That'd be another viable path. But we're choosing not to go this path in this particular build. We're going to go Lazard. And then we know, if you look at the salary structure that we have left, Ayuk, it's either like Ayuk and Kittle, or we could do like Kittle, or we could do Mike Williams, who is sort of a boom bust play. But we've already got 3 Jets pass catchers, so we're not going to do Mike Williams. That would take a pretty insanely outlier outcome for 4 Jets pass catchers to all be optimal. So Mike Williams is kind of off the board here for us. So let's click Kittle. And now we have 9,800. And so now I think our choice almost has to be between the 2 quarterbacks, because it's very rare to see 0 quarterback lineups win showdowns. Especially if we're not like, when they do win showdowns, it's generally very low scoring games. And we know that we're not building for a very low scoring game because we don't have any defenses or kickers. So I think we need a quarterback, and the choice is Purdy or Rodgers. And this is actually a really tough choice. We have 3 Jets pass catchers, and we have 1 49ers pass catcher and their running back. So that kind of leans us toward Rodgers. I think Purdy is still a viable choice here. You could still predicate this on the 49ers winning the game and on Christian McCaffrey catching a receiving touchdown. So Purdy would be an absolutely viable choice. But with running back, tight end on the 49ers side and 3 pass catchers on the Jets side, I would finish this lineup out with Aaron Rodgers.
All right. There it is. Yeah. And we're already at about 45 minutes. So I'm just going to go ahead and enter this in. But I mean, that's some great analysis. And as you can see, there's the final lineup there with Rodgers, again, CMC at captain. Yeah, I mean, I'm excited for this game tonight. I was so disappointed when Rodgers got injured in the first series last year, and I think it should be hopefully a really fun game to watch.
It was, yeah. Oh God, that was terrible to see. I would have spent really quick. What makes this lineup work and what makes it different is it is a 4-2 underdog construction, right? 4 players from the underdog. If you go look at Showdown data, 4-2 underdog builds are historically very plus EV, and that they are not played by the field as often as they win. I think you're getting some smart differentiation by playing 4 Jets versus, most lineups are more 49ers heavy because they're the favored team. And so I think that this is a lineup that achieves differentiation from what the field is likely to do, but it doesn't go like way off the board. You don't, you're still getting the player who I think is the strongest player on the slate in CMC, and you're getting him in your captain spot, and you're getting, so you're not using like that, you're not using a 1% owned wide receiver 5. I think this is the kind of way you want to think about how to build for small field play.
Absolutely. I love that. And I know you've done, you talk about all this Showdown data. You have a course, right, at 1 week season, where if people want more kind of just really in the nuts and bolts of Showdown data, and kind of like you said, it's very rare for a quarterback less lineup to win a Showdown. They can check out that course, correct?
Yeah, there's a couple of them, and I think they usually have them bundled together these days for a pretty modest price.
Yeah, I've read that. I've read through that course. I got that course a few years ago, and it's jam packed with really actionable information. So, Xandamere, thank you for joining us. Thanks for getting up early. I know it's early for you on the West Coast. I'm super excited to do this with you all season long, and super excited for this game tonight. So, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Look forward to next time.
All right. You heard it here, folks. Again, thanks for joining us. Head to oneweekseason.com for more of this kind of content, more of this type of analysis, and make sure to join us tomorrow. We'll be here on the DFS Lab again tomorrow. Hilo will be joining us on the show. Once again, Xandamere, thanks for joining us, and take it easy.